Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Well, hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. I'm Larson Hicks. I'm joined by Pastor Rich Lusk. How's it going, Rich?
Yep, I'm good, Larson. How you doing?
I'm good, man. It's good to see you. I feel like we made good on our commitment to do this again relatively soon. So hopefully we'll keep the streak alive.
Yeah, it'd be good to do it more often than we do. But we both have a lot going on.
Well, Rich, I made my 18-year-old son promise that he will subscribe and listen to all of your and Bill's podcast, Colors and Calluses. I've listened to maybe 1.5 episodes, and they're fantastic, man. I'm really excited about that podcast.
Well, appreciate that. Yeah, Bill and I are having a lot of fun doing it, and I hope it is helpful to people. I think it has been from everything I've heard so far. So we're just going to keep plugging away at it.
Well, it's a good segue into some of the stuff we want to talk about today because I feel like there's kind of a crisis with young men, especially conservative young men right now in America. We were going to talk about this topic and maybe Tucker Carlson was another one that we want to talk about. But maybe since we're already on the topic, what do you see as kind of the yeah, I have to think that your podcast is in large part trying to address a problem that you guys see. But what is that problem?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of issues. I think what young men have experienced is that they are constantly under attack. They're told they have male privilege, which they've never actually experienced. They're scapegoated for all the problems of history, which weren't really their responsibility, and mostly that's a myth or a lie anyway. You have these young men who are constantly really attacked from the left. I mean, that's obvious. With feminism, progressivism is an anti-masculine, sort of anti-male kind of thing, and it's kind of a war on God's creational order. But now, what you have is a lot of I'll just call them sort of radicalized influencers on young men, and so now they're also getting attacked from sort of the older generation on the right. And I mean, I certainly understand that. And I'm not at all sympathetic with a figure like Nick Fuentes or, certainly not an Andrew Tate or somebody like that. Um, but I'm also very sympathetic with the plight of young men today. It's one of the reasons why we're doing the podcast is because we want to speak to those men, and I think that they are in a really hard situation because there are so many things in the culture, so many things that are you could say systemically arrayed against them. The question is, what is the solution, or what is a realistic pathway forward for a young man in today's world?
Yeah, that's a good word. And I think that I'm not a boomer, and so but I get called a boomer, when I talk about some of these things because I do tend to have my knee jerk reaction when I hear these men talk is it just feels like they've adopted this victimhood kind of mentality and I don't think it's I just I see where they're coming from and I probably need to learn to be more sympathetic and quicker maybe to empathize, let's say, even though it's a dirty word on this podcast. But I tend
Episode you should listen to on that, Larson.
that's right. That's right. But it's a my reaction is like, guys, you're in America, freest country in the world, most economic opportunity of anyone in the world. I understand the perception out there in the world that white Christian men have and how attacked they've been for so long a time. And we've talked about, that what was that book that came out earlier this year, I want to say, on this topic, about kind of systemic racism.
Oh, you're thinking of Jeremy Kroll's book, "The Unprotected Class." Yeah, where he basically he takes up the topic of anti-whiteness. Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, there's a real. I mean, there's a real thing there. I've never, you know, seen a whole lot of value for anybody, to claim victimhood and have the identity of being the oppressed class, be anything but toxic, for men, especially to embrace their God-given calling. And so I tend to be quick to just really dismiss those things and try to kind of, um, shake people out of that. But I think that there is a sense that I think, um, my generation, your generation, boomers, are maybe too dismissive about some of this stuff, and if we're not, really coming alongside these men and showing them a better way, that they're going to find other, other leaders, who are going to, give them answers.
yeah. And I think that's exactly what's happened. Is there is a crisis, and I want to say this, and then maybe we can come back around to it in a bit. Young men are in a crisis situation. Young women are as well, and you really can't have one sex doing well while the other is not. I mean, because the sexes are designed for mutual interdependence. Paul makes that clear in 1 Corinthians 11. It's clear throughout the Bible. Men need women, women need men, men and women are supposed to come together in marriage. I will also say, Larson, I think, for you, the church, where you're an elder, for me, the church where I'm a pastor, I mean, I look at the young men in my church, and the majority of them are doing really, really, really well. I mean, we got a lot of young men who they get married at an early age. They generally, they generally have good jobs. For them, the pathway to success looks really clear. But I also recognize that we live in something of a bubble, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in a good sense. It's a bubble in the sense that we have protected ourselves, we protected our churches, we protected our families, from a lot of these really corrupting and corrosive influences in the world. With the progressivism, the feminism, the transgenderism, you can go down the list. And a lot of the young men in my church have got, they've got fathers. They come from families where they were well prepared for dealing with the world as it is. And so but I agree with you. Men should not adopt a victimhood mindset. Okay, that's actually very effeminate. That's the opposite of how men deal with these situations, nor should they become completely risk averse. You see that too, where you've got young men saying, "Oh, I don't want to marry because, what if 10 years down the line she decides to divorce me and takes half my stuff and my kids?" I mean, the reality is life is always full of risks. And yes, some of those risks that we've created are artificial, with things like no fault divorce and obviously all kinds of things that come in with the culture we live in, the way the family courts work, and all those kinds of things. I mean, I fully recognize all those things. And yet still, my counsel, like Charlie Kirk's counsel to young men, would be, find a marriage worthy woman. They are out there. Get married, raise a family, make yourself worthy, of her respect and admiration. Be the kind of man who can lead a family. God has designed men for that. So embrace that. And recognize too that, we don't get to choose the time and place in which we are born. Every generation's got its battles to fight, its hills to climb. If these are yours, then do the best you can with where you are, with what you have. But I think what's happened in the broader culture. So now, sort of stepping outside of the bubble in which we were in, and I don't want to say that these kind of influences never enter into our circles. They very much can and do. So we have to continue to guard and work against them. But that's part of why we're talking about this. I'm not talking about the young men necessarily in my church or your church, but just what we see in the culture at large. It certainly can leak its way into our churches. And so we want to be on guard, and we want to understand what's happening. You've got plummeting marriage rates, you've got plummeting birth rates. If there's one constant on social media, and this is not just because of the algorithm that you or I have. I mean, it's hard to avoid this. You've got, men complaining about, basically how difficult their situation is and how hard it is to, find a woman to marry. Women complaining about the same thing. There are no good men left. In a lot of cases, lifestyle choices, sort of put people behind the eight ball when it comes to that kind of thing. But still, I mean, that is the reality. You've got the average age of first-time home ownership pushing close to 40 years old, which that's really unheard of. I mean, that means we're headed towards people spending half their life in this kind of feudal economy where they don't own anything, basically. The only thing they own is a bunch of debt, and that's why it's so hard for people to get ahead. They're drowning in college debt or car debt or what have you. And so I mean, I understand there are definite challenges. So, the perspective you take on this to some degree depends on which set of stats you choose to listen to. There are people out there who will make the argument, like what you said a minute ago, that actually, we still live in the freest and most prosperous nation in the world, all kinds of opportunity out there. And actually, if you do like a true apples to apples comparison, sure, houses are more expensive, but they're also much nicer. Cars are much more expensive, but they're much better. We all walk around with $1,000 computers in our pockets. We've got all kinds of incredible blessings that no generation before has ever had. Sometimes I've made the point, I've said, like, would you rather be 18 years old in 2025 or in 1945 or 1929? You can just pick different, 1861. I mean, you can just pick different dates and say, what, other generations have had it really hard. They had to deal with the Depression or different, wars. Also, so the fact that it's hard, God did not design us for an easy life. Man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. Expect it to be difficult. Expect life to be full of challenges. God has designed life as an obstacle course, as listeners of this show have heard me talk about before, because he wants to make us stronger, better, wiser, more mature. And you don't become that without having to deal with challenges. So I think because America has been so prosperous, a lot of people bought into this idea that life should be easy. And there can always be a spirit of, you talked about victimhood, I would say also a spirit of entitlement that can come with that. So I think that is a problem. The flip side of that is that you do have challenges that are really, specific to this era that, men have to deal with that are unique to this time. So men have been under attack. Men have been shamed and scapegoated, especially white men. Again, like I said, they have been accused of having male privilege that, for these young men, they've never actually experienced any privilege. In fact, being male has been a liability for them everywhere they go. Like if you grow up in the public school system right now, you're constantly, your identity as a white male, you're constantly under attack and constantly being alienated, and your natural masculine instincts are being squashed, and you're being treated as if you were a defective girl, like there's something wrong with you just because you're male. And then you get out into the workforce and you find that, even though I appreciate all that the Trump administration has done to eliminate DEI, the reality is it's still very much there. Women are still getting all kinds of privileges and advantages that basically, in some cases, make it difficult for men to succeed. And men have their masculinity in many cases beaten out of them. They're told to step out of the way, while girls are being told to be ambitious and to not settle. And so you have this very different messaging sent to the sexes that really is at cross purposes with God's design for how we are to live. I was asked the other day, somebody said, so what is the biggest problem facing young men today? And I said, the biggest problem facing young men today is young women, quite honestly. And I don't mean that as an insult to women. I just mean the reality is most women in our culture, most young women have been deeply influenced by feminism. It's just they've been marinating in feminism. And so they're not prepared to be good wives and mothers. Everything about what the culture is messaging to them is the opposite of that. It's the opposite of the biblical message. And so, like I said, you can't have one sex doing well while the other is not. The sexes stand or fall together. And the reality is both young men and young women are in crisis. You could say the same thing for young women. I mean, what's the problem for young women today is they have been brainwashed by feminism. And this is the thing. Most women because of the way God has designed them, cannot really be happy and fulfilled in life without a husband and children. That's just what they're made for. Well, feminism is telling them that marriage is an oppressive institution, that motherhood is a form of slavery, that what really counts is career. And so what God does, where God designed them to find fulfillment, and what our highly feminized culture is telling them to pursue, is just diametrically opposite. And then you have all these women who have lived out that feminist lifestyle, and now they're miserable, and they're looking for somebody to blame. That you know, they're incredibly frustrated with the way their lives have turned out, and you know, because they don't have, maybe they didn't have a good father at home, they don't have a husband. What do? They vote for socialism because they want somebody to take care of them. And you know, and socialism also preys upon their um, toxic empathy. So I'll bring it back around to empathy. Preys upon their toxic empathy, and also preys upon their desire to have that stable protector and provider. And so rather than looking to a husband for those things, they look to Caesar. So you have just this really screwed up situation that we find ourselves in. And so it's no wonder men and women can't get together. They're just running in different directions. But I think for conservative men, you know, you think back to what Charlie Kirk said, and this is, I think, really, really helpful. You know, Charlie Kirk basically said, yes, look, life is hard, but, and there are certain challenges, but get married, raise a family, join a good, healthy church, you know, become a Christian if you're not. That was part of his message. Go to a good, healthy church, work hard, and do the best you can with what you have where you are. You know, that's always the message. And leave the results of that up to God. You know, whether or not God judges our nation, judges our culture, or blesses us, that's in God's hands. But do what you can where you are, and focus on the responsibilities right in front of you. Young men are getting scapegoated. I think in turn, a lot of young men are looking for another scapegoat, and they might want to pass it. You know, like a popular one now is the Jews. You know, a while back it was China. You know, it's been big pharma. I mean, you know, you're always looking for somebody to blame for your problems. Well, the reality is, you know, your life circumstances may not be your fault, but they are your responsibility. And so you've got to do something with yourself where you are, and become the best possible man that you can be, and make the most of whatever circumstances God has providentially arranged for you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different paths to go down here. But I think that, um, you know, because of what we've seen in the culture, and because of the ways that, that all the things that you just described that are going on have made you know, young have robbed young men in America today of a meaningful, you know, identity and a positive role in society. And it's just, and they've just been blasted with so much guilt, and you know, taught to be passive, and all of these things. I think that you've got a whole generation that is basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You know, they're looking at conservatism as in America, American conservatism, or the American conservative sort of movement as a dead ideology that offers them nothing. And again, they have good reasons for that. You know, that we have had a lot of rhinos, you know, people in the conservative movement who really are just you know, kind of you know, moderates who are just kind of playing the field, and being very kind of Machiavellian or whatever. Um, but I think that what's happened is, like, we've in their sort of anger and um, frustration with conservatism, and with the hand they've been dealt, they've thrown the baby out the bathwater, and they've been drawn to all of these what I would call just grifters, you know, people like Nick Fuentes or Andrew Tate. And history is replete with these kinds of, you know, these kinds of figures. I would put Infowars guy, whatever his name is, I forget, um, Alex Jones. I mean, these people who sort of peddle hysteria and victimhood and this kind of rage porn, or whatever you want to call it, and they've really, you know, it's like become the sport, you know, to start, you know, generating conspiracies and paranoia, and to find all these different problems with the world. And you mentioned the Jews is kind of the latest, scapegoat du jour. But these groypers or whatever they call themselves really have no positive solution, for the world. And that's the thing that I think gets lost. It's like, you're scared. You conservative Christian boomers are scared to call a spade and be bold and fight back against the way that we've been maligned as racist, misogynist, and all these other things. And so you're just polite, and because you're scared. And there's not a and I think if you find yourself in that world, you find yourself in that echo chamber on the internet, it's really easy because to adopt that view of the world that all conservative boomers, Christian boomers, and I'm air quotes around boomers, are passive and just looking out for their own interest, and are unwilling to really do battle or smash idols or whatever that they claim to be doing on the internet. And the reality is that Christian, there's a difference between boldness, and truth, and having self control, and communicating with precision, and and avoiding, just constant, inflammatory rhetoric on the internet. And I think that stuff is so it's addictive, it's fun, to read, and it's transgressive, and it feels edgy and exciting. And then you look at guys like you and me who are saying, get a job and marry a girl and become competent and join a church. And it's like, yeah, you guys are just scared to face reality and face the truth of what's going on in the world. So I feel like, I mean, to the conversation about just the conservative movement, I look at kind of this like America First agenda, for example, that I feel like is more prominent, right, in this Andrew, Nick Fuentes kind of Groyper world. They've just jettisoned, I feel like so much of what classical liberalism or free market, capitalism has always been about. And it's in my mind just a complete and utter lack of education about the economic realities. And so it's like anything that sounds like it's quote unquote good for America, it's this zero sum kind of thinking that we just need to bring the jobs back to America, and we need to get rid of any and all foreigners in our country. And just again, it just lacks any degree of, in my from my where I'm sitting, just maturity and wisdom and sophistication when it comes to the actual arguments. What do you think about that?
I think that's true, and I think that that's the thing. You have to deal with the world as it is, not as you wish it were. And so, I mean, the reality is, I mean, again, I appreciate that Trump wants to enforce our immigration laws. He's closed down the border. That's wonderful. The deportations are much more difficult to, which I kind of suspected would be the case. That you're just not going to deport as many people as as the Trump administration I think had hoped to do. And people have said, well, that's really the problem with the economy is we have all these illegal immigrants here. They get government checks. We're competing with them for housing. We compete with them for jobs. And now Trump's even sort of walking back what he said about H-1B visas, and saying that we don't have enough skilled workers, which I'm like, like if that's the issue, then let's address that. Let's address that in our school system and our college. Like, why do we not have enough skilled workers? Why aren't we?
I mean, if we can double click on the H-1B visa thing real quick. I mean, to me, there is a real problem with the H-1B program. And the problem is it's been abused for a long time, and it's been used. You have companies who are submitting hundreds and hundreds of H-1B applications for jobs that are low skill. They're abusing the program in order to get cheaper labor, so they don't have to pay American prices. That's wrong, but that's been dealt with. Like that, like the H-1B program is now, you have to pay $100,000, in order to submit an application. And so what it does is it causes a business to actually do the math of, is this going to be somebody that's going to generate, productivity, is going to generate wealth and jobs, or am I just trying to save a buck or two and not have to hire Americans? And so I don't think that's been communicated well. And so I think that, but I don't think it's a policy problem right now. I think it's a communication problem.
Well, and you may be right about that. My point was just that some of these things are not going to change. I mean, people have been talking about the lack of affordable housing for a long time. I think that's a very solvable problem, but it still hasn't been solved. So there's a lot of things like this that I would just say, you can't wait around and just complain about the way things are. You just have to deal with it and then make the best of it. Fixing that system is beyond the reach of most of us. Maybe we can play some little part in that, but the reality is, for most of us, we can't fix these really big systemic problems in our in our culture and our economy, but you can start where you are, and you can focus on the responsibilities right in front of you, and the work that is to be done right in front of you. And I think that's really the most important thing. A couple other things I want to say about this, and then we can move on if you want. But Helen Andrews had a really interesting talk at NatCon not too long ago, and then she turned it into an article. And basically, she said, the great revolution that's taken place that has not gotten enough attention is the feminization revolution. That sending women out of the home and into the workforce, it was not just adding workers. I mean, this is one of those things where it's like you see men and women really are different. It's not just adding workers to the workforce, but it's actually feminizing the workplace. And so it's had, and it's not just feminizing the workplace, but it's also actually changing the way whole professions operate. So when a bunch of women go into publishing, for example, the kind of books that get published really changes. Or when a bunch of women go into the legal profession or into psychology or into medicine, it changes the whole way that profession operates. And she says, basically, the great feminization is wokeness. Wokeness is public life accommodating itself to, I would say, fallen, but she just says feminine sensibilities. I would say fallen feminine sensibilities, but she just says feminine sensibilities. And so, her proposed solution is do away with DEI. We've been artificially privileging women over men, and in that, do away with things like HR departments, and eventually things will sort of snap back into their natural shape. I don't think that's nearly sufficient enough as a solution, but that's what she proposes. I think much more has to be done to actually deal with the problem. I also want to, and we can maybe put a link in the show description that will point people to her talks. It is really interesting. Another thing is David Green recently wrote an open letter to Rod Dreher, and I found this really interesting. He basically says to Dreher, look, the problem is, like Doug Wilson says, the reason for Christian nationalism is that secularism has failed. And I think that's true. But I would also say conservatism has failed. The conservative movement, however far back you want to trace it, a generation, 40 years, maybe 50 years further back than that, the conservative movement has not really conserved much of anything. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We won't go into that here, but the conservative movement has failed. But what David Green basically says in this open letter to Rod Dreher is, look, young men are in crisis. They go after, somebody like a Nick Fuentes because he actually understands the issues that they are experiencing in their lives. And he basically says to Dreyer, conservatives like you have offered young men nothing. All you do is scold them and reprimand them, and you call them names because they're embracing some kind of identity politics. And he says, basically, what do you expect? Their identity is being attacked, so of course they're organizing as an identity group. Now, interestingly, Green says in his article, he says, I don't like Nick Fuentes either. I don't even think that identity politics is necessarily the answer. He says he wishes that young men had a better influencer than somebody like Fuentes. And, so, I mean, we would definitely, agree with that. And I'd say in a lot of ways, Charlie Kirk was that better influencer and they killed him. So, that's a problem and nobody's really taken his place yet. But it's really interesting. Just calling young men names, often the same names they've been called by the left, is not going, they're just immune to that at this point. So if you really want to help young men, you have to figure out what it is they're up against and bring them along. And so you go ahead.
Well, I love what you're saying, and you're 100% right. And I've had a lot of these conversations. And I posted on my Facebook page the other day that Nick Fuentes is poison, and I got a lot of responses, privately and publicly. But one of the private responses I got from somebody was, you're right, but in this day and age, you need to be really precise. You need to be really clear, because for the exact reason you're talking about, these guys have been called so many names, and it doesn't phase them anymore. What I would say, my Facebook post was really not aimed at the internet. It was aimed at the people in my community who are friends with me on Facebook. And what I found personally is that I personally don't have a whole lot of hope for my ability rhetorically to move anybody off of this stuff through my social media interactions. I just don't, I don't think that, and it's funny because like in my own company, I find that I I think I'm a pretty good communicator, generally, but the difference between my skill at communicating verbally face to face on the phone with somebody and my ability to convey the same all of the same information in writing is severely, I'm severely handicapped online. And I think I don't think that's just me. I think it's the medium it's difficult to convey tone and all sorts of other things that happen when you're communicating in a real, synchronous way, in real time. So I do think there's a challenge. Like I don't have a whole lot of trouble in my experience with young men who live in my community in moving them off of this stuff in real life. I think the real challenge is the vast hordes of these guys that are just stuck on the internet, and how do we get to them, and how do we communicate to them in a way that draws them out of this stuff. So I do think that's one of the big challenges is a growing movement. It's an almost exclusively online movement. And so I do think Charlie Kirk was one of a perfect example of somebody who had found a way in and was effectively communicating to people on the internet, in a compelling way. And he addressed all of these issues, over and over and over.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, so again, there was something that you said there that I wanted to follow up on, but and I've lost what it was. But no, I think you're exactly right. I think it's really important to understand the appeal of someone like Fuentes. And again, I think the appeal is that he's diagnosing the problem, like he recognizes the crisis that young men are in, and he's not just blaming the young men themselves. He's helping them in various ways. And I think a lot of his messaging is really immature, ungodly, wicked, very problematic. But I mean, I think he does understand the issues. And I think that young men will continue to turn to sources like that until something significantly better comes along, that recognizes what the issues are and can really help them.
Well, part of the problem too, and we've kind of danced around this already, but I think part of the problem is the obsession with, what's going on out in the world, and I think this is your options are conservatives, legacy conservatives who offer their engagement with political issues out in the world, societal issues out in the world, and then you've got these groypers or whatever we call them, who are far right folks that are obsessing about what's going on out in the world. And there's in my mind there's a difference between rightly understanding and reading the times that we're in correctly, and 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 obsessing with what's going on, all the problems that are out in the world, and blaming all of your own personal problems on everything out there in the world. And so I think there's a fine line there. You and I can sit around and talk about some of these big societal issues, but we need to get, you and I are actually most of the time are focused on the work that's in front of us in the real life, in the real world with the real people. And that's the place where I think, my hope, and I have so much hope for this generation. I think this is an incredible generation. I've got two of my two oldest sons started businesses, small businesses in their teens with employees. They didn't have any capital. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any privilege beyond being raised in a Christian household with parents who love them and are cheering for them and supporting them. That is the ultimate privilege, right? And my 20-year-old is about to get married. So starting a business, marrying young, being successful in America is still 100% attainable, I think, for the vast majority of people. You're right that the challenges that these young men have are just real life role models, fathers that and this is what a godly father would do, is say, get off the internet and don't waste your time with that stuff. Let's go do something, And so I think that's what these guys need. And it's just a challenge that we face, as people in ministry, is how do we go reach those men, and how do we get them off of the internet and get them focused on the real world?
Don't let the algorithm run your life. Whatever YouTube or whatever feeds you up next, don't let that be the thing that sort of dictates the direction of your life. Yeah, that's really good. One other thing, you used the word hope there, and I think that's a really important word here for both young men and young women. I think what we're seeing is a young generation that does not have hope, that doesn't have um, that future orientation. They don't have any skin in the game. One reason why they're so against gatekeepers is because they don't have anything to gatekeep. They're not a part of anything. When you've built up an institution, of course you're interested in gatekeeping it, and that's part of what you see, and that's part of, I think, even the generation gap, is that you've got people who are heavily invested in existing institutions who are older and have poured their lives into something, and then of course they want to gatekeep it, and you've got a younger generation that says no, that's cancel culture, and so the response on the part of both is fairly understandable when you understand where they're coming from. But one thing I would say is, and actually, I know if we've got a few minutes left, we'll talk about Tucker Carlson, but Tucker actually did an interview with Charlie Kirk a while back, obviously before Charlie passed, where basically Charlie talked about why the younger generation, both those on the conservative side and the liberal side, are basically becoming economic nihilists. They don't have any skin in the game, and they think that the system is broken. And I think it's wrong to blame that on capitalism or the free market. I think that's a massive misunderstanding. The free market has generated more wealth for more people than any other mechanism ever, certainly far more than the central planners ever have in any planned socialist economy, no question. But so much of what's broken about our system is the part of our system that's not capitalism, that's not free market oriented. It might be crony capitalism, but it's basically various forms of government intervention. Why has the cost of college skyrocketed? Well, it's because the government basically took over funding it with their loans. And so, of course, colleges, they get the money right away when there's a student loan. And then the student's got to spend the rest of his life paying it back. Well, that system doesn't serve him. But what made that possible really is government money, and the government creating a system where, if you file for bankruptcy because you can't cover your debts anymore, you don't get out of the student debt. There's some very simple things we could change, radically alter that system for the better, in the interest of the young person, in the interest of the student, and we just won't do it.
Yeah. No, I heard a proposal. I heard a proposal this week. I can't remember who from, on a podcast about, who suggested that we make we put schools, colleges themselves as sort of surety on loans, on these student loans, where they have to basically be kind of in a first position to pay back these loans if their students can't pay them back. You know, which would change a lot very very quickly. You know, you wouldn't have the
You wouldn't have the worthless degrees. You wouldn't have loans made to students who are not going to be able, who have no real chance at financial success after college.
message here though is that the problem is the problem there that has wreaked so much havoc, and it really has, is government intervention. It's that the government has come in to stimulate education, and what they've really done is they've given banks a free pass at loaning, making really really dumb loans. And this is what happened in the housing crisis, and it's happening again in the education sector. And what happens when money becomes cheap? Well, the prices go up, right? And so everything gets way way more expensive, and it's ridiculously expensive now to get a degree. And then you're getting this worthless degree, and then you can't discharge that debt in bankruptcy, because the banks don't have to live in the real world, and they don't have to actually do the diligence that a bank normally would to underwrite a loan. And so yeah, it's a mess that government created, though, right? And so the answer is going to look like government getting out of it. There is a what do you do with all of this debt that's out there right now? Like that, there is a real problem that needs to be addressed there. But ultimately, the solution is let the free market do what the free market does, and get government out of it.
Yeah, and you could say the same thing about healthcare, health insurance, so many other things where it's government intervention that has driven costs up. But this is the thing, because you know, I mean, I would just say this as a generalization. So many young people, this is true of older people too, but so many young people are economically illiterate. They don't understand how that works. So, and that's why you got to, so on the left, that you've got people voting for a Mandami, to be the mayor of New York City, saying he's going to have government run grocery stores, like that's never been tried before, like socialism always fails. And it's not, to the degree that they really try it in New York City, it's going to fail there too. But one other thing, when Charlie did that interview with Tucker Carlson, he talked about the whole sort of buy now, pay later mentality, where basically, you're just living on debt constantly. And obviously people have to learn to live within their means and be content with that. That's just part of life. You're not going to get everything you want, and certainly not get it now. Learning the art of delayed gratification is really important. But I think this is really important. People who have no skin in the game, so to speak, are very willing to say, let's just burn the system to the ground. I think you have a lot of younger people, again, on the right and the left, mostly women on the left, mostly men on the right, who think that way. Historically, what conventional wisdom says is that, there's the old line attributed to Mark Twain, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative by 40, you don't have a brain. Okay. What he meant by liberal and conservative, a little bit different than what we would mean today, but you get the sense of that. Okay. But what made people get more conservative as they got older are the three M's: marriage, multiplication, and a mortgage. So you get married. Okay. So now you've got, and you have kids, you have a family to provide for. You got to think about the future, the kind of world you want to leave to your kids. A mortgage, so now you're a property owner. So now you're, there's those, I forget the insurance company that does this, but it's the ads where basically you're turning into your parents, kind of thing. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's like that there's a reality to that. We find that funny because there's an element of truth to it that, like, when you become a homeowner, you start to think about a lot of things differently. But when you've got people who are basically living as serfs in a kind of feudal system who don't own anything, and that's been the mantra from the left, you'll own nothing and like it. Well, of course, you don't care if the system burns to the ground. You don't have anything. You don't have anything at stake in that. And Trump, and I appreciate some of the good things Trump has done, but then trotting out the idea like a 50-year mortgage is basically just another version of you will never own anything and you'll like it. Let's take a little bit on your monthly payment so that you pay way more for the house in the long run. And you're not going to live long enough to ever own the house anyway. What you're going to leave to your kids is not equity, but more debt. So it's hugely, hugely problematic. And, I don't think that there's, again, the 50-year mortgage thing to me was like representative of the fact that nobody's actually interested in solving the problems that our young people face.
Yeah, and I think on the right too, one of the things that we have a problem with is it's become it's ceased being such a big tent, a big tent where you have rigorous and healthy debate. It's become so tribal, and you don't even know really where the boundaries are on any given day. We have a president who's all over the map, and like so you don't really know exactly where he stands. And so if you're somebody who stands on liberal on classically liberal, conservative free market principles, you're with Trump, maybe half the time, and you're like fiercely opposed to Trump half the time. And if you're not economically literate, the line between those two things doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, I mean, if I haven't plugged it before, Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, just fantastic reading. If you just want to get any book by Sowell, but just if you want to just get a grounding in just thinking about the basics of economics, and it's amazing how prescient all of it is. I mean, you read it and it's like it's every page is about the news, the news today. I mean, but yeah, these ideas are again, it's so I think it's so easy to be a grifter who peddles paranoia and victimhood and conspiracy, and again, the algorithm wants you to stay there. It's very lucrative. You get lots of engagement, and I think this just our message to people needs to be to get out of that echo chamber and get engaged with real life people. Go get a pastor, an elder at a church. If you don't have a father, who's helped you learn how to be a man, go find a church and go get plugged in. I was, just to piss all the people off who are Jewish scapegoat, into the Jewish scapegoat thing. I was really pleased the other day to see a video where Ben Shapiro was asked in an interview, what these young men should do, and his response was they should go to church. And the interviewer said, "Well, aren't you Jewish? Why wouldn't you say synagogue?" And he said, "Because this is a Christian nation." Uh, he said, if you're Jewish, go to synagogue, but this is a Christian nation, and most of our citizens should be at Christian churches, and that's where they're going to get a vision for life. So anyway, I thought that was awesome.
Not all of our churches will do that for them, but that should happen. Yeah. So let me, we'll have to come back another time. I was going to say maybe we could pivot to the Tucker Carlson thing. Let's just come back and do that another time. Let me see if I can, tie some of these things together. So young men and young women are both in crisis today. What needs to happen with young women? We talked about how young men need to get off the internet. I would definitely say that's true for young women who I think in many ways have become addicted to the attention that they can get online. And so, I mean, there's articles going around now about how, girls don't want to have boyfriends. It's kind of embarrassing to have a boyfriend, but part of the issue there, I think, is that when you have a boyfriend, your attention on social media is not going to be what it was because you're quote unquote taken in a certain sense. That's kind of the logic of it. And so it's better to not have a boyfriend because you can keep getting the social media attention. Okay. That's so demented. That online attention is not going to make you happy. It's cheap, it's hollow, it's worthless. But we have women who are addicted to that. Stop being promiscuous. Premarital sex makes women crazy. Okay, that's one reason why we have a lot of crazy women running around. And what happens is a lot of women think, oh, because so and so slept with me, I should be able to marry a guy like that. No, he just used you for sex, and he's not interested in marrying you. But it's created this sense of entitlement where women think, well, I should be able to land a guy like that. Well, no, that you may be way overestimating things because you allowed yourself to be used sexually in this kind of way. So those are things. Focus on the kinds of virtues that Scripture calls women to. Okay. Things like modesty, working on having a quiet and gentle spirit, being the kind of woman who, when you marry a man, can give him peace rather than drama. Okay. Being the kind of woman who can respect a man. So if you hate men, that's a big problem. And you may have had a lot of bad men in your life, starting with your dad or whatever. But if you want to have a happy marriage, you have to learn how to respect a man and understand what that means on a man's terms. Understand sort of care, so understand the virtues that scripture calls you to, have a willingness to embrace being a wife and being a mother as glorious. That is your glory as a woman. And also recognize the particular kinds of sins that scripture addresses in women. So gossip, for example, or immodesty, I mentioned that, that's a big one. Wives who won't submit to their husbands or who sexually refuse their husbands repeatedly. Those are big sins that scripture identifies for women. And so I would say, what we need more than anything right now from women, we need women of virtue. Okay, we need women who can embrace the design and the calling God has for them. I talked about how feminism has given women all kinds of opportunities they didn't have before, but those opportunities have come at a cost. And the cost is what would have really made them happy and fulfilled, which is being a wife and a mother, having a family, having that kind of legacy, having that kind of love. So women have got to recognize that feminism has failed. Feminism is a lie. It's the serpent whispering in your ear. Has God really said, and misleading you? So we've got so if women have to be reined in these ways, who's going to do that? Well, fathers can help with that. Pastors can help with that. Titus 2 says older God. Now, the problem we have is that the older women often were brainwashed by feminism too. So not just any older woman, but an older woman who understands these things and is committed to what the Bible says about womanhood. That's what women need. Okay. What do men need? Okay. A lot of men need to work on competence and confidence. Okay. Growing in skills that will allow you to take dominion and be a leader for your family and a protector and provider for your family. Growing in confidence. So you're the kind of man who can, part of leadership is being decisive, being able to persuade, being able to make good decisions. Those are all things that men need to be working on. Find a mentor who can pour into you and help you grow in very practical wisdom so you can manage money well, so you can cast a vision for your family, so you know what kind of family culture you want. And again, it's the kind of things Charlie said, make marriage a priority. Okay. Which, you're not really marriageable as a man until you've got a productive vocation. Okay. So recognize that those things go together, have children, be plugged into a church where you can find a godly band of brothers where you can hold one another accountable, where you can sharpen one another, where you can bounce ideas off one another, undertake various missions together, maybe start a business together, what have you, those kinds of things. Work really hard to be excellent in your vocation. Pursue craft competence, pursue vocational excellence. Those are things that are so important for men. And, I would say for a lot of men, the time that they spend listening to podcasts, for example, that blame the Jews for everything, that time could be much better spent improving your skills in some particular area. So pursue that. Pursue real world practical skills that will make you more marketable, that will save you money because you can make stuff or fix stuff around the house or do car repair or what have you. You can save yourself a lot of money in the long run doing that kind of thing. Learn how to invest, learn how to manage your money well and how to invest. If you're trying to figure out, if you're a young man trying to figure out what, should I go to college or not, find an older man. If, it's not going to be your dad, find somebody else who can be that man who can pour into you and say, for you with the things that you are good at, where you've got potential, the opportunities in front of you, here's where those things intersect. This is what you should pursue. This is what it makes sense for you to go after, and then go after it with everything you've got. Don't be afraid of hard work. Pursue, like I said, vocational excellence, but don't be afraid of hard work. Recognize that, like I said, life is hard by design. So men and women are both in crisis. There are things that men and women can both do to move forward. And I would say in a very real sense, the future of our civilization depends on that. If we don't get men and women together, marrying one another and having kids together, there is no future for civilization. So we've got to have these things. One last thing here: the some of the red pill and especially black pill influencers online will tell men to not marry, things like that. But they will also say to young men, "No one's coming to save you." And I would say, okay, well, other than Jesus coming to save you from your sins, there's really truth to that. Nobody's coming to save you. Part of what it means to be a man is you figure it out. Okay. When there's a crisis, you figure out what to do. Okay. You figure out what the next move needs to be, and then you make it. And we have a lot of young men today who I think because they lack confidence and lack competence, they really don't know what to do with themselves. And I know the culture obviously is opposed to them.
Well, and all of this is so good. I think that one of the things that I was blessed by growing up was sports, and I played sports in a time where coaches could chew you out and really take the gloves off, right, and make a man out of you. And I think that's gone away. It's participation awards and stuff. But your co-host of your other podcast, Bill Smith, had a post a couple days ago or a week ago or so about he made the comment that if I wanted to train for the strongman competition, I would find men like Brian Shaw or Thor, these world's strongest men kind of guys. I would go to them. I wouldn't listen to some pencil neck who's behind a keyboard who's just theorizing about what makes people strong. And he'd go find a real one. And so I think in the same way, and I'll just biographical note. I think back to the time I got married to now, which is 20, just about 20 years, a little over 20 years. Tonight's my 26th marriage and dating anniversary. So dating plus, taking my wife out. But
And you're spending time with us. We're honored.
that's right. But I think back to that, and I can tell you for every period of 2 or 3 years, there's a different man in a lot of cases, a different man who I was meeting with for coffee, once a month or more frequently or less frequently, but generally had men. It's not rocket science. It's just you look at a guy. I remember a family in our church that had really well behaved sons, and we were about to have our first son, and I remember going to him after church and going, "Hey, can we come over and spend some time at your house?" And they said sure. And we went and had dinner at their house or lunch at their house a couple times, and I just got to ask questions about raising boys and observe how they did it in their house. And then in business, I found an older guy and just said, "Hey, can I get a coffee with you and just pick your brain?" And nothing profound, just talking about life, just talking about normal things. But throughout my life, it's been pastors in some cases, been business leaders, it's been my own boss in some cases, like great employers that I've had. And I've learned an immeasurable amount of things through those relationships. And those guys didn't make some massive sacrifice. I also, they weren't, I wasn't entitled to that. I didn't show up to church and then get upset that nobody came and found me and discipled me. I just took a little bit of initiative and went and found those guys. So I just encourage young men, just do that, and don't aim for the most busy, most productive man in the entire church necessarily. That may be a harder one to get to spend time with you. But yeah, look at the men who have healthy families or healthy, you seem to be having some success in their careers, and take them to lunch, take them to breakfast. Just, hey, could I just talk to you on a regular basis? I just would love to learn. So I don't think it doesn't take a lot, but it does take a little bit of initiative, and I think it'll go such a long way to helping you start to develop as a man.
Well, Larson, this was really good. I know you got to go. We talked about Tucker Carlson a little bit. We mentioned his name. We mentioned Nick Fuentes in this podcast. Those two did a podcast together. I think next time we come back, that should be one of the things we talk about.
Let's do it.
And the thing about that that's interesting is, you kind of talked about the rift within the conservative movement, the responses to and some of that's generational. I think the responses to that episode where Tucker interviewed Nick Fuentes, I think that is representative of the kind of divide that's happening right now. And so I think that'd be a really good thing for us to talk about next time.
All right, man. It's on. Well, hey, thanks for your time, man. It was good catching up, and we'll see you next time.